Hi, I'm Robert Schultz. I'm marking time. I'm your host for this evening. Waiting for my colleague to sort of signal to move forward. Are we good, Julia?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. This is our, I'll be honest, this is our first time doing this. So bear with us. We did a little tech run this afternoon, and so hopefully all the technical issues are under control. Good evening. We're glad that you've joined us this evening. I want to welcome you to the Active Transportation Alliance Town Hall, Transit Justice Talks, COVID-19 and beyond. This evening's meeting will be sign language interpreted, and thank you to Chicago Hearing Society. Thank you to Alternative Communication Services for closed captioning tonight. My name is W. Robert Schultz III, and I am a campaign manager at Active Trans. I am your host for tonight. If there's any fidelity issues, just send a message in the chat. My colleague and team member, Julia Jeresminko, will be handling the technical duties tonight. Julia will be monitoring the chat for any issues and for any questions you may have for our panelists. We want to use questions posted to the chat during the Q&A portion later in the program. Also, thank you to all those who submitted questions ahead of time. First, a couple housekeeping items. We will be muting everyone except the speakers. If you notice you're not muted, please mute yourself. It will cut down on unwanted noise. Only panelist videos will be visible to participants. Attendees' videos will be off. Also, if you want to adjust the size of the handful of PowerPoint slides, look for the vertical bar. Change slides, Julia. Look for the vertical bar highlighted there in red between the shared screen and the video gallery. And you can adjust the size to your preference. One more quick item also. Active Trans works around the Chicago region, including the suburbs. However, tonight, our conversation focuses on Chicago's bus transportation system, CTA. Active Trans originally planned to have an in-person town hall meeting this summer, but COVID-19 intervened. Active Trans is a membership organization. Our mission is to advocate for walking, biking, and public transportation to create healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. Active Trans is 20,000 members strong. If you're not a member, consider joining Active Trans. Let's get started with a quick overview of CTA. At this point in the pandemic, currently available data says the CTA, let me do this again. At this point in the pandemic, currently available data says the weekday average for CTA bus passengers is 300,000 rides. When a bus pulls up to your stop, it is because of the interaction of multiple government agencies. On the street, it's CTA and the Chicago Department of Transportation working together to place bus stops and increase bus speeds. The federal government plays an important role in providing support and made a critical intervention through the CARES Act that allowed CTA to keep operating. However, that funding is soon to expire. Although important, we're not focusing on the federal role tonight. Excuse me. This next slide shows the streams of revenue that support CTA. Chicago Transit Authority is an independent government agency created by state legislation. The 7-member board is appointed by the governor and the mayor. The mayor's appointments are subject to the approval of the Chicago City Council and the governor's. And then the governor's appointees are subject to the approval of the mayor and the Illinois State Senate. CTA revenue is generated from fare box collection and non-fare revenues. Supplemental funding comes through the Regional Transit Authority. RTA oversees Metro and pays in Chicago's metro area along with CTA. State law requires that 50% of operating costs from public transit, fare box, and other revenue. Let me speak briefly about the panelists tonight. As elected officials, our two guests tonight work in their respective legislative bodies, the Illinois Senate and the Chicago City Council, which influence how CTA operates. I would like to thank Illinois State Senator Robert Peters and 47th Ward Alderman Matt Martin for joining us tonight. Both officials have exhibited strong interest in how transportation impacts the lives of their constituents and residents. For the past several months and during the height of the pandemic, active trans bus organizer fellows had to change how they would gather stories about how essential bus transportation is to the south and west sides of Chicago. Rylen Clark and Jamaine Gooding had to adapt to social distance organizing with the goal of finding out who were the essential workers and others doing essential tasks that were using CTA buses to get around. To recap, and so people can follow tonight's agenda, the agenda is opening statements by the elected officials and then by our bus fellows. The next segment of the evening will be some Q&A between the fellows and the elected officials. The final segment of the program tonight will be Q&A using questions submitted through the chat. So, to get started tonight, we'll start with a brief introduction by Alderman Martin, followed by Senator Peters. To get them started, we asked them to touch briefly regarding what transportation justice means to them. After their brief introductory comments, the next speakers will be our bus fellows, Rylen Clark and Jamaine Gooding. They will talk about their work gathering stories from individuals using CTA buses on the south and west sides. After their presentations, our bus fellows will engage the panel of elected officials around their findings and prospects for building CTA back better post-COVID. So just to recap again, it will be first Alderman Martin, then Senator Peters, then Rylen, and then Jamaine. Thank you.
Great. Well, can you hear me okay? Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time this evening. Thank you. A big thank you to Active Trans for inviting me to participate in this evening's discussion. I am the Alderman in the 47th Ward that is on the north side, primarily Lincoln Square, Ravenswood, and North Center, where my interests really are concentrated on are right now, one, expanding our bike infrastructure. We already have pretty decent CTA infrastructure as well as Metro. We have the Ravenswood stop, which is one of the busiest Metro stops in the system. And then the Brown line bisects the ward diagonally. Where we need a lot of improvements are from a bike standpoint, and that's where We are increasing our menu money allotment towards those things. And then second is collaborating with Cdot and CTA to make sure that from a bus standpoint in particular, that we're finding more ways, opportunities to bring in bus rapid transit. And then even small things like having wait times listed more frequently at our various stops, as well as in some of our new TOD buildings that have gone up to make sure, again, we're providing folks with more resources and more assistance when it comes to using our public transit system as well as our bike infrastructure. I'll stop there, but really looking forward to what I imagine will be a great conversation this evening. Thanks.
This is Senator Robert Peters. I'm of the 13th District, which is along the lakefront. So at the north end, it's the Gold Coast, all the way down along the lakefront through Bronzeville, Hyde Park, South Shore, South Chicago, and the southeast side next to the Indiana border. And I'll first just say, as someone who's been riding the 6 bus from Hyde Park to downtown since I was a little kid, I know how important it is when it comes to transportation access. And I think a key component, key part of this fight for me, especially on the South Side, is one when it comes to biking and making biking more accessible and protecting bikers and providing them safety. And then the other one is the fact that we have Metra, so we don't have we have the Green Line to the west, but we have Metra, and making it so that folks can take a CTA bus and be able to get on a Metro train to get to work, and making it more equitable and evening out the fare. So those are two things I think are important for the folks on the South Side, as well as protecting bikers when it comes to the northern part of the district. So I'm excited for this conversation. Thank you, Active Transportation, for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jamaine. And first, I want to thank everyone for joining us in this discussion on COVID-19 and how transit intersects with what we're going through right now in our country and in our city, specifically Chicago. I want to thank Alderman Martin and Senator Peters for also joining us tonight. Really appreciate you guys' company, and we're going to have a great discussion. So once again, my name is Jamaine, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I moved to Chicago 2 years ago to pursue my master's degree in sustainable urban development at DePaul University. And while at DePaul, I was able to expand on my interest around community, economic, and transportation development. I learned a lot about the history of urban planning in a city like Chicago and how very intentional planning strategies are to look at when examining the current state of which our city is currently in today. And even though I spent the last 2 years in Chicago learning what planning is and the effects of it, I always credit my first memories of urban planning to my childhood, growing up in New York and also in Boston, Massachusetts as well. Growing up in the cities definitely afforded me with the ability to experience, like many, what good and bad planning looked like on the ground. I remember my neighborhood having constant bus scheduling issues or serious bus bunching problems. And also the fact that my subway station didn't have an elevator, so it made it pretty difficult for the elderly, disabled, and parents with strollers to navigate through our train stations. I also noticed a lot how in my neighborhoods, a lot of the young folks mainly got ticketed for fare evasions. So these very common incidents or situations made me think a lot harder and more critically at just how much transportation planning intersected with everyday life in the city. And as we live through a global health pandemic, those intricacies become even more connected than ever. And my work with Active Transportation Alliance definitely points to those intricacies on a daily basis. So in order to fully contextualize these issues that ATA champions, I worked on a COVID-19 related survey that focused on transit at its core. And with that survey, we received critical feedback from essential workers regarding their daily ridership experiences during the pandemic. One standout came from a woman who traveled out of the Belmont-Cragen neighborhood. She mainly expressed how the buses took longer to get her to her destination because they were idling at certain bus stops. Also, thoughts about what the 6 feet of distance looked like on a bus was a concern for her as well. So safety, cleanliness, and reliability were among the concerns from respondents for the most part. And even more recently, I was a part of an outreaching effort that highlighted the sudden experiences of people impacted by the CTA-wide city shutdown on transportation. We were able to get in touch with our respondents through social media and by reaching out to the community stakeholders and members themselves. And during this effort, I called and emailed with survey respondents about their experience that day and drafted a blog response. In regards to the CTA shutdown, many folks were expressing dissatisfaction with the lack of notice and the citywide divvy shutdown as well. Now, I'm going to say, even though I have a lot of conversations about the ways transit in Chicago can be improved, I'm going to say my personal experience in Chicago has been pretty well. And these instances where bus bunching is a problem, but in my community of Hyde Park, there is accessible and frequent transit. But I'm also aware that Hyde Park has more transit privileges than many other Chicago neighborhoods. And it's through this space of transit privilege that I was able to really understand the different ways certain neighborhoods get the short end of the stick when it comes to transportation equity. More importantly, I can understand when the community has a poor transit system, everything is impacted by that transit system failure. So all I have to do is go 15 minutes west or south usually, and I can easily notice the differences in how transit is impacting those communities on a social, economic, environmental, and even public health level. So at this moment, I'm going to pass it on to Rylen so that Rylen can share their experience with Active Transportation Alliance as well. Looking forward to the conversation with you, Alderman Martin, Senator Peters, and thanks again for everyone joining us tonight.
Hello, Jamaine. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Rylen Clark, and I'm from Chicago. I've lived in the Chicagoland area for most of my life. I have extensive experience in peer-to-peer nonprofit organizations, though they primarily focused on at-risk youth at drop-in centers such as Center on Halsted and the Broadway Youth Center, both of which are in the Lakeview area. From those experiences, I come to found with the at-risk youth, a lot of them were homeless or at risk of homelessness, and they had to depend on CTA for a variety of reasons, from getting to and from shelters on time to sleeping on buses or trains just to have a safe place to lay down. My way of heightening expectations and advocating for change is something that is valuable to me in every position I may obtain, and these skills have been exceptionally helpful with my position with Active Trans. I have been a bus organizing fellow with Active Transportation Alliance for several months now. In the month of March, Active Trans released a survey during the shelter in place to get feedback from essential workers around Chicago on public transit and if it is still operating safely and equitably. We use various social media such as Twitter and Facebook, as well as reaching out to our partners and individuals already connected to Active Trans. We found that bus bunching was still an issue that the virus amplified, and buses passing up riders when it reached its new limited capacity also impacted how equitable transit was. Many riders that were interviewed were concerned about safety in a broad sense, in addition to curiosity around CTA's methods of cleaning. One rider who I interviewed expressed her difficulties with getting bus drivers to allow her to the front of the bus as she is disabled. She faced a difficult decision as if her safety could be jeopardized with openly admitting to having a disability. And then, in response to the recent transit service shutdown across the Chicago region, we released another survey on its impact to Chicagoland riders, from protesters to people trying to access the city to shop and get to work. I interviewed several individuals, and their main concern was their inability to get to and from work, little to no time to make plans on a safe way to get home with the curfew, and increased difficulty getting to the protests happening around the city. I live near the south suburbs, and transit out here is very limited, from how often they run to how early they stop running. Navigating this area can be incredibly time-consuming. Depending on what day it is or the time of day, it can take up to 45 minutes just to get to a train station, not to mention how the constant road construction disrupts transit as well. None of what I have listed seems like transit equity to me. Public transit span across the Chicagoland area is an incredible example of what to do in metropolitan areas, but at the same time is an example of what not to do. From a lack of safety from a lack of safety, to substandard levels of cleanliness, public transit may be in a good place, but that does not mean it does not have any room to grow. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our presentation and introduction. Now we will take the time to ask the questions we have prepared for Senator Peters and Alderman Martin.
All right, thanks, Rylen. All right, let's get right into the discussion, shall we? This section of questions will be for the both of you, so feel free to jump right in whenever you see fit, all right? So first, what is your first thought that comes to mind when thinking of creating a more equitable Chicago? And that's for anybody.
I'll let Robert take this one first.
This is like, just so everybody knows, this is like our third Zoom town hall in like a month, right, Matt? I believe. Yeah, we're just really figuring this out. So, what does equitable transportation look like in Chicago? If we had Copenhagen's bike network, or the Amsterdam bike network, I'll take New York subway, but clean and neat, or maybe I'll take Seoul's subway system. And if we could combine the two, where everyone can get around either by train, bus, or bike, and they felt safe doing so. That's it. The question's so broad that it's almost like that's the ideal, and that's what we want to build. To get really nerdy about transportation, about this, I visited LA, not known for its public transportation. I got on, I think it's called the Yellow Line now, or the L Line, or it used to be called the Gold Line. And it was it was light rail, but it was very simple. It was quick. It was clean. It was straightforward. And I think there's just a way for us to, get to the point one day where we're able to combine light rail and heavy rail and bike and buses, particularly on the South Side, and that folks who might live in South Chicago can have an easier time being able to get to other parts of the city, and that we use transportation to break down very terrible segregation that exists in Chicago. I mean, one of the key things that segregate the city is the fact that they use the highways to divide it up. I mean, I did a tweet where I talked about how when it comes to racism and when it comes to police violence, that the interchange is like a shaker, in the city. And I think in the ideal, world that we build to, it's to be able to combine both some of our older used, heavier rail with, bike and bus accessibility, combined with, one day, a dream I built for light rail. I want to be able to get on Lakeshore Drive and have like light rail take me from, Navy Pier down to, the U.S. Steel site, and we have affordable housing combined with it. I mean, that's the ideal thing. And I think transportation helps, it's the key, it's the connector to more equity, both in the workplace and as well as when it comes to a home and groceries. So that's sort of my ideal take and my nerdy take on light rail for everybody to have. And I'll turn over to Matt Martin, and I'll let him answer.
Well, thanks very much for that handoff, Robert. I appreciate it. For me, when I think about it, I think about two things. The big, I think, elephant in the room is what the federal government can be doing and should be doing, because when it comes to the rail that Robert was mentioning, it's really challenging to do maintenance, much less expansion, without the federal government devoting a significant amount of funds. Same thing with regard to affordable housing. Like, you're struggling to deal with what we've got at the state level and especially the city level in terms of modest resources. So it really boxes us in terms of how visionary we can be. But I think it really starts there in terms of if we had real significant investment that was sustained from the federal government, we could do incredibly ambitious things to make it so that we don't see Chicago through the lens of that that kind of heat map, if you will, in terms of however you want to measure a number of things, that too often it's just a reflection of the sorts of segregation that Robert had identified, and transit's no exception. When you look at dedicated protected bike lanes, where even more recently with COVID, shared streets popped up. And so I think we really need to make sure that we have an engaged federal partner there, and it's going to help on a number of levels, not just with regard to transportation, but environmental issues, which I suspect we'll be touching on this evening. When it comes to what we can be doing in spite of rather than because of the federal government, I think about improving our bus network as well as biking. And we know what a lot of that entails. Some of which would mean, say, more regular capital bills from the state level, so that it's not a once every 10 years sort of thing. But it means that we have plans, especially at the city level, that are actionable. And it's not just, hey, in 20 years, we want to do this. And then we'll have a check-in in 20 years and we'll say, oh, that was really bad. We got 10% of the way there. But because the report has so much dust on it, we kind of forgot about it. But instead, we can put a report in place, and then it has reporting requirements so that city council and other stakeholders are meeting consistently when it comes to those issues. And so I think several areas that come to mind. One, bus rapid transit, so dedicated bus lanes along our major arterials is going to be critical. Too much of, I think, what we have right now is very downtown focused based on the L. And so if you live in areas like the 47th Ward, which is bisected by the Brown line, you can get down there pretty quickly, which is one of the reasons why it's like rent and mortgages are more expensive in the 47th Ward than in some other areas, because people are willing to pay that premium, just like they will for schools, just like they will for perceived safety. So that needs to change. I think we can set up some pilots. We can figure this stuff out. We started dipping our toes into it, but I think we need to go all in on that. The second thing is protected bike lanes, and not just doing a better job of having bike lanes, but them being protected with barriers, because it's just too often the case where you hear of fatalities or near fatalities. And it's not just around protection, but it's also around incentivizing folks to not just commuting to and from work, but when they're running errands, they know, hey, it's going to be the same amount of time or even less if I can just pop on my helmet on like Sunday afternoon where there's traffic and I can just zip right over to this thing. And then combining that with working with some of our locally owned and operated businesses, our bike shops, so that folks can get outfitted so that they have the sort of equipment needed to make that trip a successful one. So again, we've got some big issues. We've got some more modest issues that we can move on unilaterally, but having a plan in place that holds us accountable as government after we've already identified what those immediate next steps are.
Definitely. I do agree as well with you, Alderman, about expanding transit equity outside of the downtown area into our community areas in Chicago is definitely important and a very, very, very big topic a lot of folks are talking about, which leads me to my second question for you both. How do you see transit as an element for social and economic justice in your district and or the state of Illinois?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in my district, I would say that I have a district where many of the essential workers are living on the south side of the district, and they go to work on the north side of the district. And the way that they get to work is by public transportation. And so when that is less accessible, when they aren't able to do that, that makes their life even more difficult. And then they go to a stressful job. You combine that with the fact, so that's just on the sort of work side, that people's transportation point A, point B. And you combine it with the fact that just when it comes to the maintenance of, our bus stops, the fact that we don't have any protected, bus lanes here, I think on the south side, we have metro stations that are constant need of being cleaned up. If you compare the metro stations, in South Shore to the ones that are in the North Shore, it's just, the investment's just, it's completely off. And so to me, it's one part that we need to make these stations look nice. We need to make that look, something to be proud of. It's another part of making it easier for folks from, the south side to be able to get up to the north side. And then we have a bunch of folks who are going to and from class, school and going home. the way that they are able to get by and to get through the neighborhood is going to be by bus or by bike. And if you're young and the fact that there's no protected bike lane, you're at risk. So I think to me, it's one thing, just sort of a worker justice piece. It's another thing of like, when we think about youth and the community and the investment that needs to go into it piece. And, I think the thing about transportation is that the more accessible and easier it is, the better it is for the economy. There's a reason why when we talk about the hipsterification of development between sort of 2007 and 2018, 2019, it almost is always the idea from every urban planner is to talk about public transportation, and the difference is who gets to have that public transportation and who doesn't. And I think equity and the economic drivers here and the justice behind it is that everybody has the right to that type of public transportation. It shouldn't be a luxury, to a specific few. So.
I think the point about jobs is absolutely right on, because when you don't have that sort of access, and we've heard several folks today already mention that, means that you're spending more time in transit or waiting for transit, which just, I think, impacts your quality of life and impacts the sort of jobs you can have, certainly impacts childcare options for folks who need to travel long distances while also making sure that they can pick up their kids in a timely fashion. When I think about it in the context of our ward, it's really interrelated with development. So we have a lot of development that's happened, not just currently, but before I joined, that was centered around transit-oriented development. So if you're living within, if it's a development that's within a quarter mile of a transit stop, and we've got a lot here in the ward, so a good portion of it's TOD eligible. So folks are using that as an opportunity to trade off additional units, bike parking for those car spaces that too often people aren't using, which I think is tremendous. It also means that we can put more units of modestly affordable housing in those new developments, which again, it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve the affordability issue, certainly in our city, not in 47th Ward, but it's something that we can do with some regularity, which means we're moving the needle in the right direction as we're waiting for other folks to put together that more robust, comprehensive plan. I also think about it in the context of when you have more transit, it means that it's not just those folks who are going to and from work, but folks who, for any number of reasons, don't have cars, choose not to have cars, or aren't able to have cars. So you're talking about the elderly in certain situations. You're talking about differently abled individuals. You're talking about youth. And so when we are investing in public transit, we're investing in increased mobility for those individuals to, I think, lead healthier and dignified lives. The final thing I'd emphasize is the environmental piece. Even just today, you're talking again about, I think it was the Sun-Times, a very good, very depressing article about the impacts of flooding from our recent heavy storms this spring, and how the effects, at least measured by complaints, are disproportionately located in portions of the South Side in particular. And so when we're talking about why that is the case, we're talking about the climate emergency that we're in. We're talking about the fact that the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the U.S. is now cars ahead of livestock. And so when we have warmer weather, which can hold water vapor more, it means more frequent storms, more severe storms, and it's kind of exacerbating. It's that never-ending cycle, it seems, that communities that have already been disinvested in are feeling the effects of that in more ways than one.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I can't say how many times I've went to a bus stop, and the first question asked to me is, how long have I been waiting? It's usually some of the first questions I get. And to your point, Senator Peters, on the aesthetics of the station is very significant, because, it plays a role in people's perception of public safety in a way that can deter them from even being a potential rider. So that is very important to highlight, which leads me to my next question, my third question, around folks who can speak to that work on these committees, right, around transportation. So my next question is really, how is transportation related to or intersects with the committees you sit on?
I'll take that one first. So as I mentioned, the environmental impacts that poor transit opportunities can have. I don't serve on the Transportation Committee for City Council, but I do serve on the Environmental Protection Committee. And so a number of the things that we're talking about are ways in which we can improve transit and just generally reduce the impact of automobiles on our environment. It is a tricky situation when, as was discussed at the outset, CTA is a sister agency, which means it's not something that City Council has direct oversight over. It certainly doesn't control their budget, kind of like CHA, the Housing Authority, as well as the public school system, which means when we have folks reaching out to us, even when we have great conversations like this one, where we're identifying a lot of shortcomings that we would like CTA in part to take the lead on and addressing, City Council isn't necessarily in a great position to help spearhead that. You're talking about too often our executives, the mayor, and to a lesser extent, the governor. And so I think that when we're talking about ways in which we can democratize our democracy to make sure that more voices are heard, I think that this is a situation where it just can't continue to be the case where you have one person, no matter how good they are or challenging they are, be responsible for not just like our big city departments, but also these sister agencies of like creating legislation and policy, ushering that through, enacting it, and then fixing the problems when they invariably arise. I think that we do need to make sure that we have more directly accountable entities that help spearhead these initiatives so that it's not just every 4 years an up or down vote on this one person who has so much say over everything, but instead there are opportunities, there are inflection points whereby residents can let folks know we are not where we need to be from a transit standpoint. And it's not going to be an unelected board who hears from me, but it's going to be some sort of directly elected individual who's responsive, who's going to hear my concerns and then respond by saying, here are the policy proposals that we're thinking about, or better yet, here's what I'm thinking about, but what do you think? And let's do this together.
Absolutely. Senator?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I'm a criminal justice reform advocate, and part of the key piece to me is how we have to reimagine what it means to have safety and justice in this community. And the first part is the fact that when it comes to being young and Black and CTA, you're at risk for interacting with the police, and we need to reduce those interactions. Like that shouldn't happen. And so that's sort of the first part. The other part is, you know, Alec's been going around the country trying to pass bills around critical infrastructure. Parts of those bills impact our public transportation infrastructure, and the risk is those bills, allow you another excuse for someone to be caught up in the criminal justice system. So again, that's something that, you know, being part of the Crim Law Committee and the Public Safety Committee, that's something I just don't want. I don't agree with those bills. That's something I don't want at all. The other part about reimagining the safety and justice is that it's not just that I want to reduce the police and public transportation and get the criminal justice system outside of the public transportation system. When we think about it comes to a bike, when it comes to bike justice, again, there's a police interaction, the city and how it tickets Black folks when it comes to biking. Again, reducing that, getting rid of that would be ideal, but reducing that is something that we need to fight for. So that's on that front. And the other part is that we need to make it, again, increase the accessibility of public transportation. It's clear, as Matt said, that we need the federal government to play a role here. But I think having folks like us screaming loud and clear that we need the federal government to play a role here is something that is special. And I think more and more of us doing that, the better. And so I think that's two parts that I feel like I can stop the criminalization of public transit that says who's allowed to be on our public transportation systems and who's not. And I think that's a role I can play specifically within committee. The other part is I may not be in transportation on the transportation committee, but I got to be an organizer as best as I can be. It's a little different than city council in Springfield, and that means advocating to friends and allies I have on the transportation committee around around active transportation. So a good example of that is the Capitol bill. There were a lot of fights that came down to the wire, but we were able to move hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to go to public transportation. And I think that is an example in which I was not on a committee, but we were able to have those conversations and help move the funding that needed to come in to expand public transportation and bike transportation, and really make the city more accessible and more equitable.
Thank you. Thank you.
So now the baton of questions is passed to me. I'll start off with, to what extent do you feel you can influence policy on committees which you aren't a member of, but impacts transportation in your district or ward?
Well, I think I partially answered that one with transportation. Again, I'll just continue to try to be an organizer within the Senate and the House, and I was an organizer before here, and that's something I'll continue to do. As well as, so that's sort of like that's the inside baseball, and then of course the outside baseball is not only doing more of these town halls, but whenever asked, to try to bring more people into this space so that they can actually interact with folks in this space and increase the influence we have with the outside game. And if we can bring those two together, and we have the last chair of transportation was a particularly nasty chair, and we have a better chair in the Senate when it comes to transportation, who is progressive and who is open to looking at transportation from a very different lens than the previous chair. So I know we have someone we can talk to who I'm sure would actually love to be on things like these town halls. So.
From a city council standpoint, I think that there are several things we can do outside of the committees that I'm on, and even outside of the transportation committee. One is through the budget. As I mentioned earlier, we in our office have started using menu money more than most other wards to improve our bike infrastructure. And that's something where we could really aggressively advocate, which we're working to do, for an increase in that menu fund allotment, but also making sure that it's not this flat allotment, which right now is $1.32 million per ward, regardless of size. So a ward like the 10th ward, and I think that Senator Peters represents a good portion, if not all of that, you can fit 5 North Side wards into that ward, including the 47th ward, but they still get the same amount of money as we do for just general infrastructure, which means they are going to use a lot more money more often than not on resurfacing, because they just have a lot more to cover, and that's just going to be a need of theirs. But if we can make sure that, one, that menu fund is going up, and two, that it's getting divvied up in a way that reflects needs as well as the overall geographic size of wards, then that's going to free up more aldermanic offices to think innovatively about how they spend those menu funds beyond just resurfacing and lights, which, don't get me wrong, that's important, but we need folks to do more than that with their funds. Another thing that's important is working with our different city departments. And so I'm thinking about Cdot, for example, where there are things, there are opportunities that come up where you can pilot programs in your own ward and lead by example. So a good recent one that we had the benefit of was a shared street, the first time in Chicago, where due to COVID, we, following the lead of a number of other large cities inside and outside of the US, we shut down streets to through traffic so that we're not losing parking, because we know that that's one of the many third rails in Chicago politics, especially at the local level. But we were making it so that aside from parking for residents and delivery trucks, that we're opening up those local streets more, so that as you're feeling how narrow those sidewalks can be due to COVID, that you can socially distance, whether you're walking, you're jogging, you're biking in the streets, and that you don't have to be nearly as concerned about cars as you are normally. And so something like that was born out of us really reaching out to Commissioner Biaggi from Cdot early and often to advocate for that, and then collecting information from residents about which streets would they be most interested and seeing become a shared street, so that we got buy-in from the administration, in particular Cdot. We figured out how to execute that, but then we also got buy-in from the residents. They didn't feel that this was being imposed on them, but instead that they had a voice, and that it was based on this mapped-like survey, I guess, dot map program, whereby we were able to figure out what the first good street, the first good pilot would be for this. So that's something that in the city anyways, I don't think can be like exaggerated, which is the benefit of getting buy-in from those commissioners and then pushing this stuff through that way.
Thank you both. Just touching up on what you said, Senator Peters, I agree with you completely with getting that conversation started is one of the most important steps. And like you said, Alderman Martin, just realizing, amplifying the difference between equality and equity, especially in terms of just space in general. My next question, in what ways have you collected and used feedback to make sure all Chicago communities have equal access to transit? And how will you continue to do outreach on this issue?
I'll start with that because I think that it is piggybacking on what I mentioned a second ago, which is for this, when we were thinking about what sort of which streets would be great shared street pilots, we shared an interactive program with residents whereby they could essentially put down pins in different areas, and in doing so, say what their interests were. And it could be around shared streets, but it could be around a number of other things as well. And so I think that was a very helpful experience for us, and is something that we'll continue to utilize. And we were able to share that database with other wards so that they could figure out how they could better solicit information from residents about a whole host of things. We also are in the process of doing several town halls with regard to the Chicago city budget. We have, I think, our next one tomorrow, which is going to be around transportation and infrastructure. And we have a survey that applies to the entire budget, but has a significant transportation and infrastructure piece as well. So we want to make sure that we're both educating folks around what our budgets have looked like in the past with regard to transportation, but also based on that information, soliciting targeted feedback from them, so that even during these austere times, we can make sure that we are investing in thoughtful ways that are responsive to the needs that we've identified around issues like transit inequality.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got a particularly boring answer compared to an alderman on this one. And I'm not going to pretend I have nearly as good of an answer when it comes to this as an alderman. But what I can say is, you know, I've been on town halls, particularly with Senator Ron Villalom, who's the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. And so there's been conversations with groups, you know, in terms of bringing equity when it comes to transportation. There are folks who, you know, in the community who organize around making it so they've been organizing for a long time around bringing transportation equity. They've done forums and town halls. I've taken meetings with them. There's Active Transportation Alliance, had those conversations with them. There's the fact that, you know, when it came to the capital bill, talking to aldermen specifically about the things that they needed that were transportation focused. But in terms of how active I've been, it's more coming from a 10,000 foot level than it was, you know, it's been so much on the ground. It's more about if I need to press when it comes to capital funding, if there's money to be able to be moved. That's sort of where I'm at, and it being able to advocate after after someone's pushed me on it. There's also, you know, that's been mainly the main focus, has been trying to just make sure that the money is moving, and to make sure that I'm playing that role in Springfield. I think that pressing other people around, you know, I don't want to say anything that will get anybody thrown under the bus, but we have Jeffrey, Stony Island, which is very unprotected and needs a bike lane. And that's been something I've been talking about constantly because it's not the safest ride and has contributed to a lot of people getting killed on the road. And that is something that I still talk about and talk to the local alderman about. And I think that's just sort of where I can be, is also advocating for those things to the local officials on that one. So.
Yes, thank you both. I think, again, continuing to foster those relationships, those connections that you have, whether it's on a local level with from Senator Alderman, just to the people that you represent as a whole. And my third question before the baton is passed again back to my coworker, Jamaine. What was your reaction to the transit shutdown? Did it affect you and your constituents?
What was my reaction to the transit shutdown? I was not happy about the transit shutdown. And it did impact, I mean, my district was part of an area. I was very upset about the transit shutdown, and I let it be known to the people who needed to hear it about how upset I was. And was just another example of a long-standing history of dividing the city up and using a crisis to do so in the name of supposedly protecting people. And it literally stranded people who were trying to get home. And it was a weird military tactic and a sense of control. And it just it just showed to people how much control they have over their city using this, how little control people might have over their city because of this shutdown. So I was absolutely furious about this shutdown. It impacted the downtown part of my district, and it impacted the south side part of my district. And it turned downtown into a green zone, similar to Baghdad, that gated off an entire part of the city from its people. And that's one part with the shutdown from downtown, and then the shutdown at night that just abandoned people, and they weren't noticed. They were given 30 minutes notice, maybe at best. And given the fact that if you're working during that time and you're not checking your phone, that you don't even get that notice until after it's happened. Yeah, it was absolutely disgusting, and I let folks who needed to hear it.
So Robert mentioned something earlier, which was, and also mentioned it there as well, like the devastating impact on our essential workers. So if you're thinking about folks who are at grocery stores, many of whom are earning very modest wages, and as a result might rely on transit more than some, it was devastating for those folks. We had a lot of individuals from a number of our grocery stores, and we have a lot, reach out and say, I don't know how I'm going to get home. And then some of our grocery stores, not all of them, stepped up and provide and essentially covered the ride, like an Uber or Lyft ride home, and did that not just for that first evening, but for a number of days, which was good and the right thing to do. But then when you think about the fact that we were and continue to be in COVID, I mean, do you want folks who otherwise would not want to be put in a position where they feel compelled to get in a car with somebody, to get in a car with multiple people, where they're concerned about contracting COVID potentially? It just was not a sound decision, in my opinion, and had issues for folks who, whether they were working in food retail or at hospitals. We had some physicians and nurses reach out and say, look, with transit down, I don't have a car. I live in a ward like the 47th ward because it's got some pretty decent transit access. So what am I going to do now? Am I going to hop on my bike and ride all the way down there? Well, we don't have as much, as I mentioned earlier, protected bike lanes the way we would want to. So it's like, I don't necessarily feel safe biking 5-6 miles all the way to downtown. Would much prefer to be able to take a bus or the L. So I think for the folks who we're relying on more than anybody right now to keep our community together and to keep it as healthy as possible, we put them directly in harm's way. So I think to put it politely, the unintended consequences were severe and terrible.
And can I just add to this, because this really did piss me off, and I was particularly offended that Lyft or Uber was sort of passed out as a gift card, which just adds to the privatization of public transportation as a mindset. And by doing that, it normalizes the idea that your ability to get around is by this third-party private, tech company. And to me, it's just like another example of sort of an American neoliberal action when it comes to a public good. If it is a public good, it must be used for the public and it must be open for the public. It is not on an individual or an entity to shut down that public good for the public and to use a crisis to do so, and then to back that up by using Lyft to carry that, to help people get from place to place. That is not how we're going to have a public good. And for too long, we've used crises to disinvest in public goods. And that's why we have a city of the haves and have-nots. And this is, if anything that 2020 has shown us, is that people have had enough with that. And if that ever happens again, I hope people make it very clear to the people who need to hear it that that is wrong. I personally, I just remember 2003 and how a crisis we just do this over and over again. Katrina, this was one about racism and law enforcement, people acting out and speaking out in the way that they felt was right. And in return, folks were trapped downtown or they were trapped at work, and that continued for way too long. And I think we all need to make sure we speak out, about that, because we just see crises as an excuse to turn a public good away from the people who need it most.
Yeah, I agree with the both of you, 5,000%. As I spoke on earlier, I interviewed people about how the shutdown affected them. I had one person who was a grocery store worker. He unfortunately doesn't have access to things like a credit card or an ID or a social security card, so he wasn't even able to take Uber or Lyft. He doesn't even have a bank account. He had to rely on the kindness of a friend to get him a ride back home, and that wasn't even for all 3 days. He had to walk 3 miles to and from work, talk to a person who works in a hospital downtown, and they're worried about people even coming in, let alone the effects of COVID-19 on themselves and their coworkers and their patients. So it's truly disgusting and disturbing that they would even take that measure and then back it up and continue upon it for several days.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone's saying. And just a quick time check. At the moment, we have about 30 minutes left. So for the sake, I'm going to ask 2 questions of my 3 for the both of you. And then Rylen would ask a question. And then after, we have a set of specific questions for the both of you. And then after, we're going to open it up to the audience questions, because we have a lot of awesome questions waiting in there for the both of you. So just switching gears a little bit. My next question for the both of you are, Chicago only has about 5 miles of dedicated bus lanes, while peer cities have dozens, including some that have been rolled out during the pandemic. Should Chicago expand its network of bus lanes? And also, what barriers do you see as elected officials to increasing the mileage of bus lanes in Chicago?
I'll go first. I want to speak to the barriers point, because you probably won't hear a ton of alders say this, but I think this is a very much an area where aldermanic prerogative is a problem, because what happens is you're going to have so many folks, when we were talking about like how to bring a bus lane, a dedicated bus lane on board in areas outside of downtown, you invariably talk about your bigger streets, your arterial streets, where there's parking. And so there are 2 consequences of that. One is you might take away metered parking, and pursuant to our ridiculous parking meter agreement, you have to figure out where else you can make up that revenue, i.e. where you're going to move those metered parking spaces. The second one, and the bigger problem, is just the loss of non-metered parking, and folks who are accustomed to, even if they have access to garage parking, whether it's their own or their broader buildings, they like to, or maybe need to be able to park their car somewhere. And so they are going to light up your phone lines as an alder person and let you know, I do not want you to do something like a bus lane or protected bike lane even, that would take away these valuable parking spaces. And so when you have a small group of dedicated folks who can light up an aldermanic office, which, they're small, that you're supposed to be responsive, but sometimes it's folks can get tyrannical in a way where these policies are consistently taken off the table because folks from a hyperlocal standpoint just say, I don't want to put up with the stress of fighting. And that's where you need some of these plans. You need to be able to have a Department of Transportation, a CTA, working with others to say, look, we value your input as elected officials of your micro communities, alders, but this is the sort of thing where it makes sense from so many different fronts. On so many different fronts, the question isn't whether we're going to do it, it's how we're going to do it. And so I think it's one of those situations where if you're freeing up folks so that they're not just concentrated primarily or exclusively on the delivery of core services, but they're able to think about that, but also in the context of broader policies like we're talking about right now, I think that's where you can start to see more transformative policy. So until we kind of directly address aldermanic prerogative in that context, as well as zoning context, we can have a similar conversation with regard to affordable housing or lack thereof, especially when it concerns newer developments. I see that that tight-fisted grip that folks want to have over their communities as in many ways perpetuating the inequalities that have been with us for generations.
Definitely. Senator Peters?
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to add on to that. That was quite the answer. But what I think that there is a sense of NIMBYism. I think that one of the key ways to be able to move, honestly, I think it's a federal government thing, to be honest with you. Funding from the federal government can incentivize the development of, and you're talking about dedicated bus lanes, right? If I'm correct. So I think the idea is, yeah. So I think it's the fact that we need to change the incentive so people are willing to take the risk. And it'd be much easier to take on constituents who might not want something if you're saying there's all this funding to build something from the federal government. That's something that I just feel like would make the most sense. It's why you're able to get stuff done with a capital bill, because you're saying we got this funding to get it done. It makes it easier to try to push it through. I do think that there is this, being hopeful about something that's bad, with the fact that we're in an economic crisis and we do need to spend some money, combined with the fact that I don't know how many people are going to go out to get new cars. So I don't know if people are going to spend the money. Even your normal NIMBY person might actually not want to put their discretionary income into a car. There might be a space to, at least in a more polarized, both economic and I think political calculus, to say that might be a chance to start pushing that the NIMBY population on this might be smaller than it was, say, 4 or 5 months ago, only in the fact that people's ability to buy a new car is reduced. So combine that with a greater incentive with federal dollars might just help move things. But then again, I say that as this is a city that literally built a highway around a church because Dan Rostenkowski didn't want to build the highway through the church. And so then we got the traffic jams that exist there, but he was okay building the highway through a Black community. So this is a complication of Chicago, but that's my best hope for that. And what comes to an answer on that. So.
Definitely. Well, I do have a question about alder boarding. I really want to hear you guys' take on this question that I have for you both specifically. I really want to know if do you support fair fares where the cost of transit is reduced for those at or below the poverty level, and free transit for young adults and students? I guess we could start with Senator on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I do. I mean, I have a feeling that I do, and I just think that it's going to lead to a similar fight around the subsidized Metro line in CTA, and using your venture card and being able to go from Metro to CTA, and how there seems to be a budget consideration constantly made. So I think it's something that it's there. I think it would be great if we realize that subsidizing Metro rides can also, I mean, to be honest with you, it's the fact that we have such a divided public transportation system. in the region. It would be much easier if we could share the cost. But I do agree, and I do think that's something that we need. But I'll let the city alderman answer the question next year.
Yeah. So yes, to both of those questions, I think it's a situation where we should be thinking about ways to incentivize folks to be using public transportation earlier and more often. And I think putting aside public health considerations, I think it's just the sort of thing where we need to make sure that folks are using this as much as possible because it's sustainable, and the more folks use it, it's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you can point to their increased usage as a need to invest more and more resources into it, and hopefully making a better pitch, not just at the local level and city level, but also at the federal level. So I think that absolutely makes sense. And I'm sorry, did you ask about all-door boarding, or did I mishear that?
I had a question about that, but for time's sake, we may address it in our later questions from the audience members. So at this moment, I'll pass it along to Rylen. Rylen's going to ask both of you some specific questions, and then after that, we're going to get into the questions from the audience. Sounds good? All right. So now I'll give it off to Rylen.
Hello again. So my first question is to Senator Peters. Some of CTA's highest bus ridership is on buses that operate within and through the district you represent. How can you work with Cdot and CTA to make sure all neighborhoods in your district meet equitable transportation standards such as bus frequency, reliability, affordability, and accessibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main thing is, one part is putting the inside baseball pressure on them when it comes to this, and the other part is working particularly with the Transportation Committee around subject matter hearings when it comes to this issue and bringing it out into the public space, in the public arena around equity. So I think it's one part, just inside baseball, of making the calls, putting as much pressure as I can in those conversations. As I say this on a Facebook Live, so I don't think it's that much inside baseball. And then the other part is being able to use subject matter hearings as a leverage point to put pressure on those departments to actually to do more. I think there is an argument to be made when it comes to state money and when it comes to capital dollars. For instance, the J14. Those stations are getting worse and worse. This was supposed to be this great, amazing bus line that became underfunded. The stations, if you go to 71st and Jeffrey, it's just been torn up. It does not actually incentivize people to want to ride the J14. So making it so that also when you're going to get to the bus lane, or you're going to get to the bus, that you actually are in a safe and it looks like something that's been invested in, is something that definitely I can do in pushing CTA to put more money into that. So that's sort of what I can do at the state level, and it's sort of just a combination of funding, advocating, putting pressure, both inside and outside. So yeah.
Yeah, agree. There's a way to apply pressure directly, but also still somewhat in a passive form, because that's how you deal with politics, I suppose. And my next question will be for you, Alderman Martin. This will be the last personal question. We attended the talk you gave on police accountability. CTA has a contract with CPD for $10 million per year to patrol the CTA. There was a recent police shooting on CTA after the mayor announced an increased police presence back in March. What are your thoughts on how police accountability intersects with public safety on transit?
Good question. I would say it feeds into broader conversations that we're having right now, and in my opinion are long overdue, around what's the primary or core responsibility of our police department, and what are conversely the sorts of things that we're asking them to do that for various reasons it doesn't make sense for them to do. And so when I think about the shooting that happened, if memory serves, it was someone who was like the violation that he was alleged to have committed was walking in between train cars, right? And so that got him on the radar of two officers, that they were having a conversation once he departed, and I think was in an underground on the Red Line, and then altercation ensued. He was running away up the escalator and an officer shot up at him. And can you imagine a situation whereby, and he was shot. Thankfully he didn't lose his life. But if someone had been walking down, or just like a bystander had been shot, those are the sorts of things where we need to be asking. Same thing with regard to, I think, responding to a number of 911 calls that say it's issues involving housing instability, mental health instability, where someone does not pose an immediate threat to themselves or others. We should be taking the lead of places like Eugene, Oregon, where they've got this great system called Cahoots, where they have essentially an ambulance where it's a social worker and then a medic who are going around and they're dispatched to incidents where there aren't allegations of violence going on. And I think these are the sorts of things where we need to be constantly looking at opportunities to expand those sorts of approaches and minimize the opportunity for someone who is carrying a gun to interact with somebody, because there are just way too many situations where a shooting starts with someone who is alleged to have committed a minor violation is stopped. And so I think that it's situations like that where I'm really tired of putting out statements saying that I'm deeply disturbed by X, Y, and Z. And I instead want to make sure that we are taking tangible steps so that we are exercising compassion and care in how we're dealing with folks, especially folks who are experiencing crisis. And so if it's someone who is, for example, in this example, going between train cars, that should never, ever result in someone being shot. And so that's the sort of thing where it's not enough to look at it from an accountability standpoint and say, well, were those officers investigated quickly and were they held accountable swiftly for what appeared to me, based on the video, to be an incredibly unjustified shooting, but saying, to what extent can we take steps to prevent something like this from happening again? Because this was not a situation that happened in isolation. It was a situation where you had folks who were concerned about what they perceived to be an uptick in thefts and other things on the CTA. And so one of the responses was dispatching armed officers to patrol the CTA. And so I think things like this are sadly inevitable, and we need to make sure that we're taking steps to roll that back.
Thank you for your answer, Alderman. I apologize in advance. My neighbor's dog is very agitated. I'm not sure if anyone can hear it, but agree with you 5,000% on just stopping these incidents before they even happen and assessing the level of risk. Like, is someone's life immediately in danger? Is someone trying to harm themselves? Is stopping this person who is supposedly committing a crime worth risking someone's life over? Just thinking about that question before you escalate to the point of shooting someone.
Absolutely. I mean, just that was not the sort of incident where that was the justification at the outset, putting aside whether that was a real justification, but that was not the sort of incident that was pointed to as a reason to have increased patrols of CTA. So it's just incredibly aggravating, and I think it was inevitable that something like that would happen.
Agreed. That would be the last of the questions that I have for you individually. I'd like to thank you again for your time and pass it over to Jamaine.
Yeah, thanks for that answer, Alderman, and also for yours as well, Senator. Quick time check, we're at 7:17. So I think now is a great time for us to open up some questions that we received from the audience and folks who RSVP'd with us. These questions were chosen by us, and after that, we're gonna also touch on some of the Q&A questions that we also have in the chat as well. So my first question, well, one of the audience members' first questions is, what do you think about making CTA bus service more accessible to people with disabilities? And that could be for either of you two. That's just one of our first questions from our audience members.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a must. I think that needs to happen. Not just the bus service, but sometimes being able to get to and from the train on the station, it's inaccessible. And, you know, I think when we talk about justice, we have to include disability justice. You know, I was born deaf, but I in terms of physical, I have pins in my hip, pins in my knee, various surgeries. I know for a fact that it's gonna hinder my ability to, you know, to walk up and down stairs. The less accessible that we have public transportation, especially when it comes to our, you know, disabled brothers and sisters and folks, are the worse it is. So I definitely think that's something that we have to get right, both when it comes to our buses, when it comes to our trains, when it comes to the stations.
And one thing I'd add to that, this is a modest one, but this is the sort of thing where if we were thinking innovatively within a plan, it could happen, which is, as I'm sure a lot of folks know, when we're talking about our bus system, we're often talking about folks who you don't have a covered bus shelter. Even if you do, there isn't always thought given to what takes someone from a bench or the shelter over to the bus. And so if we were thinking about strategically doing proactive auditing of our various bus stops to make sure that when someone gets on or off, that they're not, for example, having to do so via grass or dirt that could be mud or ice during the winter time, that is the sort of thing where if we just have a concrete pad where someone would get on or off as opposed to grass or mud, that could mean the difference between someone who's differently abled or an elderly person wanting to take the bus consistently or not. So that's something where we've spent many money on that. I'm sure some folks would say, look, like never spend any money on a sidewalk or something like that. You should only spend it on resurfacing streets and alleys as well as lighting. But those are the sorts of situations where we're happy to do that. I think that's important. I think that that's something that involves transit justice and equity, but it's also something where like an aldermanic office shouldn't be the one who is asked to take the lead on that, because there are just going to be too many situations where maybe because we don't have the capacity to do those sort of proactive audits, or we're not hearing from residents who've identified that as a concern, and as a result, it just doesn't get done, and we're not being as accessible as we can be. And this, it's a modest thing, right? It's not a lot of money, but can have a tremendous impact.
Absolutely. For my second question, I'm going to pull from the Q&A and see if I can get one of these questions correctly. I'm going to pull from the Q&A, and then after Robert would ask one of his next questions, well, he'll pull a question as well from the audience to ask both of you. So this question is from an anonymous person and goes, how are we supporting putting more public transport options for the working class, filling the need for, oh, the question went away, sorry. How do we protect long-time community members from the negative impacts of gentrification that comes with transportation infrastructure improvements? That was the question.
I'll speak to part of that, which I think is a consideration around housing. So as we improve transit infrastructure, I mean, we don't have a lot of recent opportunities, unfortunately, with regard to rail, but we do with regard to especially improvements around buses and bikes. That we need to be very sensitive to those displacement concerns. And so that's something where we, in addition to having a comprehensive transportation plan, we need a comprehensive affordable housing plan, because approximately half of all renters in the Chicagoland area are rent burdened, which means they have to spend over 30% of their take-home pay on income, on rent. And so as you see transit options improve, and kind of piggybacking on Robert's earlier point about the hipsters and kind of the sort of demands that they make, or the things that they're interested in, and how that can lead to gentrification, at least in some areas. I think we need to be really cognizant of what does it mean to maybe disincentivize the demolition of certain buildings that are absolutely doing great work, and housing people in a more affordable way. There are obviously environmental considerations too when you're demolishing, because most of that the housing components are going to a landfill. But also when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, transit-oriented development, when we as a city level are giving developers, I think, increased incentives to build along our transit lines, especially trains, but also buses, that we need to make sure that we have more robust affordability demands, but also more tools that can be right-sized to different communities, so that it's something where you've got this particular baseline, but depending on the type of project, how much of it is affordable, what else it's proximate to, that we have different options in terms of working with folks to bring in more affordability, because I think that that's a tremendous question of, if we are doing the sorts of things that we're talking about today, will that just lead to the sort of displacement that we're actually trying to minimize by bringing better transit access to areas that haven't seen it? So the housing development piece, I think, is a really critical one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, when I said the hipsterification, it wasn't necessarily about individuals. I'm wearing a rose print shirt, so I don't think I'm actually one to speak about this as an individual level. What I mean by that is that like, you see cities chase that all the time. They chase it for some sort of ideal that may or may not exist. That is not an equitable way of doing things. They're chasing some sort of trying to Williamsburg everything. And that's what I meant when I said that. I want to make that very clear on a systemic level. The part that gets to me is, so here on the south side, there is an area where development along rail is a risk for gentrification. And that is on the Green Line right by Garfield. It's like a gold line it's a gold mine of property for developers and private equity. It's 55th and King Drive, where you have the Green Line Garfield stop. Now, to me, the key part is that it has a lot of vacant space, and they're trying to build that up to sort of gentrify it and sort of connect that part, down to Woodlawn, down to South Shore, and create this sort of broader Hyde Park area. Now, I'm not supposed to be, as a politician, talking about how that's a problem, but that is a serious problem. And if you see that line that stretches into Woodlawn down to 63rd Street, we're talking about a bunch of development that is not equitable. And so that's generally up to the city when it comes to the development. But at the state, we can sort of restrict this. I mean, when it comes to rental regulations, when it comes to affordable housing funding, when it comes to policing, there's just a whole host of things that we can do at the city that actually prevents what is normally done to push people out. I mean, in terms of these policies, whether said or unsaid, when we look at, for instance, in Louisville and the murder of Breonna Taylor, part of that was developed around a policing strategy that was to push people out of an area for development. Those things they don't need to be said. They don't need to be a formal policy. They can be left unsaid. And the risk here is that a lot of things in Chicago when it comes to policy are unsaid policies or practices in which few people actually talk about them. But folks at the state can actually limit that. And I think that's a role that I play in helping to make sure that we don't see sort of mass gentrification happen. And it's one part preventing people from being forced out and then uplifting people who are there. And the other part to me is that there are a lot of folks who are struggling. We talk about this, the out migration isn't always to Atlanta or Charlotte or New Orleans or New York or LA when it comes to Black folks in the city. The out migration is also folks being pushed out to the south suburbs, where then they get to the south suburbs and their property tax bill is 30% of their income. Well, what we can say is you can actually, it's a cheaper property tax bill, but what we've also brought to you is a grocery store and a community that's uplifted. And I think that's at that point a way for us to prevent gentrification, have people come back to the community, lift them up, and sort of create a more, to make our city more whole in terms of policies. So
Definitely. I agree completely. And I got some questions. We have some more questions from the audience. Rylan's going to pull some and give some more for you guys because we are watching the time. But yeah, Rylan, you have any more questions from the audience?
Yes, I believe we can just fit in about one more. Are you, technically three, are you concerned that people who would normally commute via public transportation will start driving personal cars to work to avoid crowds and potentially contaminated surfaces? What effect could this have on the city, and what can we do to help prevent it?
I'll actually be really brief. I think that I don't have too much of a concern around cars. You know, there's a risk there, but I think that we are in a very serious economic crisis, and I just think that we're going to actually have more people who need a robust public transportation system because they're not going to be able to afford the car that they need. Even people who we normally think could afford a car might not be able to afford a car right now due to the economic state that we're in. And so I think that car dealers, car manufacturers will try to push this sort of narrative and push this. And Uber's recently done ads trying to push the idea of a car, but I still think we're going to have people who are really relying on our public transportation system, and we've got to be prepared to serve them.
My thought around that is yes, in parts. I think it might vary community to community, but if you look at some, like say the CTA ridership decrease, that was some of the steepest decreases have been along parts of the Brown line, where I think maybe you might have a higher than average population of white collar workers and or individuals who can work remotely. And so at least in the short term, as we continue to figure out how best to keep ourselves safe from COVID, particularly before an effective vaccine hits the market, I think that is a concern. Same thing with regard to certain metro lines. Again, not all of them, but certain of them. And I think as one of the earliest slides of this conversation indicated, way too large a percentage of CTA, and I'm sure Metro's budget as well, comes from fares and other things that have to come from the local level as opposed to the federal level. So I am concerned that even in the short to medium term, as you see a continued, maybe not decline, but flattening out as folks get more comfortable in certain areas where folks have an option, both from a transit standpoint, like they have cars, as well as folks who might be able to work from home more remotely. I am concerned that you're going to see real draconian cuts to our system, which means that when we are really up and running again, that folks will have less faith in the efficacy of our transit system. So it's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy, that kind of shock that Robert had mentioned earlier. So I want to make sure that we're being really diligent right now, working with our state and federal partners to ensure that that doesn't come to pass in a year or two from now.
Great. This has been a really great discussion, and like all things, when you plan things, time goes so very quickly. So real briefly, I'm exercising my role as the Ed Sullivan of tonight. Jamaine has a share about the action we're advocating about this evening. And then Rylen will talk about how you can get involved in your ward. And then I'll just wrap up real briefly. So if I think it's Jamaine's on next.
Yeah, so, first, I'd recommend, everyone join the 47th Ward Transportation Committee, or see if your ward has a transportation committee. If not, work with your alderman to set one up. Definitely important. A lot of key decisions are made here. And, I'd just say get involved and getting as engaged as possible locally. And I second also, we'd love to hear your feedback. So feel free to message us personally via email or social media, or Active Transportation Alliance social media, or even through Julia's email as well. We do have one more action step that Rylen will mention, and then we look forward to seeing you guys carry these out.
Yes, Active Transportation Alliance currently has a call to action for 30 more miles of bus lanes as well as masks for riders. Feel free to copy down that link, and I will also be putting it in the chat. We would like this to be put into the budget and completed by the end of 2021.
Hey. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Oh. All right, there we go. Lastly, I get the easy task. Active Transportation Alliance is your advocacy group for doing work around advocating for biking and walking and public transportation. If we support people in organizing in their communities around those issues. So there's plenty of addresses on this slide. You can always go to our website. We're only as strong as our next member. So please consider joining Active Transportation Alliance. I wanted to extend a warm thank you for all the participants this evening, both you in the audience. At our peak, I think we had around 60 people on our call. I want to thank our elected officials, Senator Robert Peters. I learned a lot from you tonight. I also learned a lot from our Alderman, Matt Martin. It's been such a pleasure working with my colleagues, the bus fellows, Rylen Clark and Jamaine Gooding. And thank you for our interpreters and our chat. We worked on this. We wanted to make this as accessible to as many people in Chicago as possible. And thank you for Julia, my colleague, for doing such a bang-up job on the technical level. And just thank you for everyone for being here. If you'd like to see Active Trans do more of these type of activities, let us know, because I don't think we'll be meeting face-to-face anytime soon. So please expect to see more of these in the near future. Thank you for everyone for taking time out of your evening tonight. Goodbye. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.